partly because there's a lot of European firms that are thinking twice about doing business in Russia. You can see this with capital outflows and so forth. And of course, the great State Department report that sees like the firms that are actually targeted by sanctions in Russia with subsidiaries and branches abroad have really been hit hard by this policy. And today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different, which is Russia's export relations. So this is the way that Russian exporters, whether it be minerals, metals, oil and gas, agriculture, the way that their relationships and their networks have been affected by the imposition of EU and Western sanctions beginning in 2013. And just in case you have to leave in the next 8 minutes, I have two main findings. And one is that I really want to emphasize the importance of the decoupling between the ruble and the oil price beginning in about 2015, 2016. And that when that decoupled, it's given the Russian government much more ruble-denominated revenue than it anticipated after seeing its fuel exports drop. It's given a lot more budget flexibility going forward. It is now stockpiling some of that money back in sovereign wealth funds that it did, just as it did in the 2000s, maybe potentially gearing up for a spending spree if another crisis hits. And the second is that the data I'm going to look at, especially the Russian exporters, are partially turning toward the east. Now, this is incomplete. Russia is still very, very dependent on its exports to the EU, both in natural resources and outside. But there's been this emergence of new partners, whether it be in Southeast Asia, or in Asia, or in East Asia, or South Asia, and the Middle East. Russian exporters are developing new relationships and new partners in getting their wares out there. Maybe not in the most value-added sectors, but there's some important trends that I'm going to show you some. So why exports? Well, there's kind of two strains of thought about how sanctions can affect Russia's relations with the world. The first is that negatively, right? If you're a Western firm and you're thinking about where you're going to get really key inputs, whether it be aluminum or some other type of rare mineral, just to make your production chain work, when sanctions are imposed, even in a targeted or smart way, they increase the political risks of doing business with really any firm from that country. Because one, it's hard to do due diligence and figure out who those beneficiary owners are of your partner firm. And maybe you got it wrong, and there's going to be some legal punishment over the horizon if you didn't get your research right. And the second is, well, you just might be wary of new sanctions being brought to the supplier that you're working with. So why get into a long-term relationship with a Russian firm if around the corner the United States is going to impose more sanctions and profit it out? The flip side of this is that most cases around the world, sanctions are associated with a drop in the exchange rate. In this case, especially with the drop in the oil price, Russia's exchange rate has really weakened, and that's going to make its exports more competitive. So this is kind of a countervailing factor. There's a lot of political risk of doing business with Russia under a sanctions regime, but at the same time the exchange rate is going to be weakened and Russian exports are going to be much more competitive on world markets. To give you a sense of what this looks like, I'm going to look at UN Comtrade data for the last 7 years. So this is probably the most comprehensive data we have on Russia's exporting relations with the world. It covers most of the natural resources sector. Arms are not calculated by the UN. There's a whole other industry that's just dedicated to seeing Russian arms exports. The key thing here is that this gives us a pretty general picture about how trading relationships have changed before and after the 2014 sanctions are imposed. So just some statistics here. You can see that Russian exports before the sanctions were in the 450 billion range, and they dropped in terms of US dollars by about 40 to 50% going forward, and continuing just to steady there, about 280, 300 billion. And a lot of that is through fuel exports, and I'll talk about that in more specifics. And that because of that drop in fuel export revenue, you can see that the percentage of exports coming from oil and gas goes down markedly between 2013 and 2017. So that's a bit of the diversification, some hint through some descriptive statistics that other types of commodities are playing a more important role in Russia's exchange profile. And a lot of that has to do with the ruble exchange rate with the dollar. But this is specific to a couple different sectors. In this left chart, I'm going to plot the non-fuel exports versus the fuel exports. So fuel, we're thinking just oil and gas. And you can see after the sanctions hit, exports of fuel drop dramatically and become almost on par with non-fuel exports, like metals, agricultural, forestry products, other different things, other inputs that Russia is quite abundant in, is that putting on world markets start to become nearly on par, depending on how you crunch the data, with oil and gas exports in dollars. But when we convert it to rubles, which I think is the key for understanding decoupling, Russia's export revenues really haven't been hit nearly as much as we might have expected with the drop in the oil price and with this new political risk. And if you just look in nominal terms of rubles that the government of Russia Inc. is bringing in year on year from its exports, it's actually gone up by about 20% since 2013. Yes, there's been inflation. When you calculate that real exchange, it becomes more or less on par. But that's something to really keep in mind, that the budget has a lot more flexibility. Rubles are still coming in an important and interesting way. Second, really briefly, it's interesting to break it up between sanctioning and non-sanctioning countries. We have 37 countries that impose sanctions on them, and they stopped buying Russian oil and gas in a really, really big way. However, if you look in ruble-denominated terms, the rest of the world is now becoming an even more important oil and gas market for Russian oil and gas. And when you look at these non-oil and gas exports, you can see upward trends for both sanctioning and non-sanctioning countries, with non-sanctioning countries, the rest of the world, the East, buying more and more of key products that Russia's embarked on this large industrial policy experiment with import substitution. I'm not going to claim that that's a success in any measure, but we are starting to see the data suggest that there's movement on non-oil and gas exports to the rest of the world. So a couple takeaways as I finish up. This decoupling of oil price and exchange rate is really propping up Russian aid. The budget surplus is 3% last year. It could be in that range going forward. Through this budget rule, all the excess rubles are going back into sovereign wealth funds, so they're kind of saving for the rainy day that they did in the mid-2000s, potentially in anticipation of having to need that money to prop up social services or something else going forward. You do see this potential trend evident of both greater export diversification away from oil and gas, but also new trading partners. I don't want to be on record saying that this is the beginning of a different Russian economic model. But these are signs we've been looking for the last 20 years, and policymakers have really been emphasizing, saying we want to decrease our reliance and our dependence on oil and gas exports. And in fact, only within the last couple of years are we starting to see some kind of rebalancing in the way that Russia deals with the rest of the world. As a kind of preview of things to come, you can also look at this not just at the product level, but you can look at it in terms of the firms that are benefiting or really doing well under these conditions of political risk, and start to connect the dots and seeing that some of the subsidies and regulations and preferential treatment for Russian firms are filtering exactly to exporters that are enjoying a lot of success and autonomy under sanctions. Again, this may or may not peel them away from the regime. It may not create frictions within the entire Russian economic community, but we can't simply just look at oil and gas to explain where the Russian economic model is going forward. We need to at least put some of our attention on these new partners and these new sectors. So, thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Nigel Gould-Davies from Mahidol University International College in Thailand.
Good afternoon. I'll make 3 points in these 8 minutes. The first point I'd like to make is really an invitation to think about elites in Russia today and what role or roles they might play in the next few years. We reached a consensus quickly in the first panel this morning over the nature of the difficulties which Russia faces and that it must grapple with in the years ahead. I think Brian put it well in his policy memo when he said that Putin's current term is the most difficult one that he's faced so far. We've had some discussion of possible responses to that, responses on the part of Putin himself, and responses of the Russian state, the Belarusian-Russian Union, the future of that, the alarming potential for a short, victorious war, and so on. We've also had some discussion of societal responses and changing attitudes and moods. I think elites are the ghost of this feast, and their potential role merits closer attention. I emphatically support Maria Lippmann's suggestion that we need to look at other actors, and especially elites, which are literally by definition those sections of society with disproportionate access to resources who are disproportionately well placed to protect their interests. So let's think more about elites. We heard a little bit about elite turnover this morning. That treats elites as objects, not as subjects, things that can be turned over, rather than groups with interests, calculations, perspectives, and incentives to bring about change. or at least protect their interests. And of course, let's remind ourselves that in global perspective, change, if and when it happens in almost any system, usually comes from within rather than from below. It's elites that begin to drive change, and this has been the pattern we've repeatedly seen across post-Soviet space since the early 1990s. I always embarrass him by saying this, but Henry Hale's book, Rationale, if you have not yet read it, is something you have to read, because he goes through in magnificent and comprehensive and very elegant detail a series of episodes, big and small, where apparently strong regimes, led by apparently strong leaders, disintegrate very quickly when elites begin to defect from them. Could Russia be different from that, or might it exhibit a similar pattern in future? We might want to conclude that elites, in fact, will not play such a role, perhaps because of some Russian exceptional feature, that Russian elites are really a kind of a service nobility in the long tradition of patrimonial state. However, if we were to argue that Russia is an exception to much larger generalizations that we've seen across space and time, that's a conclusion that needs to be argued carefully for and not assumed. That's my first point. The second point is that it's particularly interesting to look at the potential role of elites in the sanctions era, because Russian elites, and one particular section of those elites, are exceptionally dependent upon the global economy. Not only the global economy, but international, specifically Western systems of the protection of property rights, assets, and reputations. This is one way, incidentally, in which the contemporary period differs decisively from the Brezhnev-era stagnation, comparisons with which were made earlier. There was no such private elite at that time in the early 1980s. So I'm referring to the so-called oligarchs, a useful, if imperfect, term of art, those whose enormous concentrated wealth depends primarily on at least nominal ownership of private assets, rather than state corporate leaders or those whose wealth derives otherwise from direct contact with the state. Now, of course, we know that in Russia, property rights are less than what they might be in some other countries, but nonetheless, there's an important principled distinction, I think, to be made between the so-called oligarchs and those whose access to wealth and power derives explicitly from state positions. Now, let's remind ourselves that the oligarchs were extremely influential in the late 1990s, brought to heel very quickly in Putin's first presidential term. Was that loss of power and status forever, or could that, at least in some form, in some future set of circumstances, be reversed? At the very least, it's clear that it was easier for the oligarchs to reconcile themselves to Putin's new political economic dispensation, because they were able to compensate for the loss of their security and power in Russia by enjoying access to Western systems of asset protection, property protection, and the burnishing of reputations overseas. The paradox, therefore, in the last 10 or 15 years, is that as Russia has become more adversarial in relation to the West, an important part of its elites have at the same time become more dependent on the West. It was a very interesting paradox. This is why sanctions are so important now. In particular, the sanctions that were imposed last year, which for the first time directly and explicitly target major private owners of wealth in Russia. Complementing that, the EU, especially in the wake of the Salisbury nerve agent attack, has begun to scrutinize much more carefully than before the provenance of the wealth that comes into its country and of the wealth holders coming to its country. No further than the difficulties that Roman Abramovich ran into in trying to renew his investor visa recently. So we've seen suddenly a great deal of anxiety among very large private owners of Russian wealth. How might they respond to this? So I would argue we now see these oligarchs in a position of unprecedented anxiety and insecurity, partly because they're slowly beginning to be deprived of access to the systemic benefits of engagement overseas. At the same time as that is happening, their position within Russia is becoming more difficult. New demands are being made of them within Russia by the Russian state itself. So what potential options avail them? They might choose to become closer to Putin, to seek some kind of protection from the Russian state, get close to the Russian state, closer than ever, try to, and heed the calls. They've successfully resisted so far to de-offshore, go back to Russia. That's one option. They might seek non-Western ways of protecting their assets, perhaps going to Singapore, the Far East, Hong Kong. That's the second option. They might seek just to keep their heads down and muddle through and hope the difficulties go away, which they won't. The final, most intriguing option is that they may feel that more incentivized than they ever have been before to turn their vast fortunes and their networks of connections into means to protect their interests in Russia's longer term through some form of change, whatever that might be. I'm not suggesting some kind of cartoonish coup or anything like that, or regime change, absolutely not. But I raise the question at the very least that sanctions may have the most significant effects through the ways they shift the calculations of those with disproportionate access to resources, especially at wealth. There's more to say than that, but I have no more time, but hopefully we can take up these themes in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Our next speaker is Irina Busygina from the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to talk about, I'll tell you a story about Eurasian Economic Union. And my co-author is Mahidol from the State University of New York. And I will start with saying that we all know the Eurasian Economic Union, and I'm not going to go into details, 5 countries, when, 2015, and so on and so forth. What I want to say is that normally the people say that the story about Eurasian Economic Union is very boring, as all the stories about the Russian-driven integration projects as the Commonwealth of Independent States and so on and so forth. However, what I will try to show that this is something new about this institutional compromise. And the idea, and this is my question, the idea is to understand, try to understand why did Russia agree to build something new. To build something new, at least we probably see that this is new. This is stronger multilateral institution, and this is the puzzle is why did Russia agree to do this under conditions that the bilateral cooperation is much more preferable not only to Russia but to both parties. So both to Russia and to smaller counterparts, namely these 4 countries, the members of the Eurasian Economic Union. And here's my main argument. My main argument goes in 3 parts, and this is first, again, Russia is likely to benefit more from bilateral bargains. This is what I already said. And this is bilateral is preferable choice. And then the specific of multilateral compromise grant the smaller member states an opportunity to be more successful in bilateral bargaining. So we try to show that this story is not about multilateralism, although we say it's stronger, but still it is still a story about new impetus and new shift in the bilateral relations between Russia and the smaller member states. And as I try to show, the balance is shifted in bilateral relations. The balance is shifted from Russia to the smaller member states. And this is my 3rd point, saying that the choice of the Russian leadership to build this Eurasian Economic Union reduces and not increases Russia's relative power in the post-Soviet space. Okay, so about bilateralism a little bit. The Russian leadership never hid that the main idea was that in the core of Russia's relations with the post-Soviet nations was not multilateral but bilateral relations with each country individually. And this is how the bargaining process, organizing or building together all the unions, how it was developing. The next thing is that probably, Kirill here will not disagree with me, but here I will say now at this point that there is almost no economic rationale for Russia to promote multilateral cooperation in Eurasia. If you would look like Liebman and Vinokurov and Liebman again, you will see that this is enough evidence showing that to pool these resources together brings almost nothing. And how the redistributive mechanisms, how they now are developing and how they are in operation in the Eurasian Economic Union, they work in favor of the smaller member states and not in favor of Russia. So the economic argument doesn't work yet. Then another point is the launching of the Eurasian Economic Union, and it was S5. We now have to look at the year 2011. Was a part of the electoral campaigning. It's not only the case in the Eurasian Economic Union. And what I wanted to say with this slide, basically, that it was nothing new in the whole project till the 2014. It was the same thing, including Ukraine. Probably it was still the hope that the Ukraine could be included in the project. That the negotiations they developed incrementally, like with all other projects, through hidden bilateral relations. Nothing new. But my point is, or our point is, that it is something new now in this what was created through the institutional compromises in the Eurasian Economic Union. What changed after the Ukrainian crisis? That for Russia, the new thing came to the agenda. This is the increasing international isolation and stagnating economy. Okay, demanded, we all know this, demanded domestic consolidation and quick launch. What I here want to stress, speed. This is the speed. It was incremental, so they worked on it like this, like work, okay, so we want to build something new. Now the Ukrainian crisis changed the idea of the speed. The time suddenly became very important. So, speed, we need it now and not sometimes. But at the same time, very important lesson from the Ukrainian crisis, from the Yanukovych. Applying too much pressure could be counterproductive. You need it now, but you cannot press too much on the leaders. So this is the situation where Mr. Putin found himself. So that's why. So this is kind of the explanation why the compromise was this and not the other. The smaller member states, okay, after the Ukrainian crisis was changed, they increased fears vis-a-vis Moscow. This is understandable, because it was the idea was that under this, that the post-Soviet borders are still not fixed. They could be changed. So, and what is the after Ukraine, how we call it after Ukraine effect? Now the Kremlin wanted to do it quick, wanted to do it, couldn't press too much, and couldn't and cannot afford to lose any member of the Union. Any member of the Union, be it Armenia, be it Kyrgyzstan, not talking about Belarus and Kazakhstan, who have the longest record of being with Russia from the beginning of 90s. So now this is the constraint. Russia cannot lose anyone. The threats of leaving the Union, it would too. Thank you. The threats of leaving the Union now, they're open. Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Nazarbayev are quite open in saying that Mr. Nazarbayev said, when I see the very small sign that our sovereignty, national sovereignty is in danger, I have my right to leave the Union immediately, but immediately, without any consultation with Mr. Putin. And this is open, they are open. So not only Kazakhstan, but also the other leaders. Significant economic concessions, this was the one part of the price that Russia had to pay for the speed and not pressure. And the implications for the bilateral relations, relative weakening of the Russian position in bilateral relations. My last slide, this is what to expect. We still believe that bilateral relations between the smaller member states and Russia will preserve the priority over multilateral relations in the future. That for Russia, the best option is to preserve the status quo. To preserve the status quo, without moving, without major shifts, because this is the best position for Russia at the moment. The smaller states, they have more bargaining chips now. They are trying to combine the formal loyalty, showing the signs of the formal loyalty to the Russian establishment, to Mr. Putin, combined with the limiting elite and the level of the society, limiting the Russia's influence on the domestic, political, social, cultural, and we collected many manifestations of this. I don't want to time. but many manifestations of how they do it. Again, the existing status quo is the best option for Russia. And my last point, what I want to say that we touched upon the topic on the first session. We touched upon the topic of the Russian-Belarusian Union. And I think this perspective that I presented to you, this is one of the possible points of entry into discussing the probability of this union. If we could do it, I would be very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irina. We'll now have remarks from our discussant, Anders Aslan from the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to discuss three interesting papers. I'll start with Nigel's paper, which is micro sanctions, move on to macro measure, and then take Irina's paper last. On the micro effect, I think that Nigel is very right that they have had very substantial effect. You can see that when Putin discusses sanctions, he discusses them in three categories. The worst are the Magnitsky sanctions, the sanctions of his friends, and the April 6th of last year sanctions that went of his friends and oligarchs. He dismisses the sectoral sanctions of finance and oil, and he has himself introduced the counter-sanctions on food, because who cares about the Russian people? Certainly not Mr. Putin. So what Nigel discusses here is, can one divide the Russian oligarchs through personal sanctions? And I think that the answer that he provides is yes. And the Hirschman line is you have three kinds of reactions: exit, voice, or loyalty. And what we're essentially seeing is that most of the old oligarchs are exiting in one way or the other. And this means that a massive capital outflow from Russia, which is important. There are about $800 billion of private Russian money abroad. So this is a big chunk of the money that disappears. And those who stay, they can't do very much. But the question is, can the West really go after the important ones? If I take the 8 most important oligarchs, and I'll name them, the brothers Rotenberg, Gennady Timchenko, and Yuri Kovalchuk. All 4 are sanctioned by the US, but Timchenko and Boris Rotenberg are Finnish citizens, so they are not sanctioned by the EU, which shows how successfully you can integrate yourself into the West. And then we take the 4 most important oligarchs who are operating and fronting for the Kremlin in various ways: Roman Abramovich, Oleg Deripaska, Alisher Usmanov, and Suleiman Kerimov. Kerimov and Deripaska are now sanctioned by the US, but only from last year, thanks to Kazan. And none of them is sanctioned in Europe. They are too integrated into Europe, as we saw with the Rusal sanctions, to be sanctioned by Europe. And this is a big question. What do we do? The answer is actually quite simple and straightforward. Anonymous ownership must no longer be allowed. The ultimate beneficiary owners of all assets must be made public. I'm Swedish. In Sweden, this has been the case since 1766. So it's perfectly possible to maintain it. It's the same in the other Nordic countries since the 18th century. The European Union has now, in the 5th anti-money laundering directive, adopted this principle, and it has to be adopted everywhere within a few years. This is what has to be done in order to make the sanctions effective. And I completely agree with Nigel that this is a very effective way to do. What I don't agree with is an oligarch can't influence Putin today. This, I think, is you can't get the voice inside what Putin so well taught Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So the second paper on what David's paper on about the effect of sanctions on Russian exports. Yeah, this is what the paper discusses, but the real question is whether the sanctions are effective, and exports has not been the target of the sanctions. It has been finance and technology. Technology is difficult to measure, at least in the short term, while finance is quite measurable. If we stick to the exports, which is of course an interesting measure, even if it's not the target measure, the share of exports to the European Union has fallen from 45 to 40% during the time of sanctions, which is not much. It's approximately the lesser weight that the European economy has had in the world. So we can't really say that there's been any effect on the EU economy from the sanctions, while, as David rightly pointed out, most of the effect comes from the oil prices. It's a SEPS paper by Daniel Gross and some co-author that pointed this out. I think that you have a reference to it. And macroeconomic stability, as you point out, for sure. But the important thing is minimal growth. Diversification, not in real terms. You show it in nominal terms. But it's simply that the oil price is lower. That happened in the 1990s also. So what should we focus on? Finance. Again, as I said before. So at the beginning of 2014, Russian foreign debt was $730 billion. That's total debt, public and private. Right now it's $450 billion. So this means that Russia has lost $280 billion in international finance, and that's 17% of current GDP. So this is a substantial part of investment that is not happening. On top of that, FDI has almost ceased. Last year, FDI was $2 billion, which is nothing. So it should normally be 3 to 4% of GDP. And these are big resources that Russia has not got every year. And that means substantially less growth. How much? The IMF had a paper from 2015 that suggesting 1 to 1.5% a year, which I think is quite reasonable. So David, you're right, the sanctions have not been effective on the exports, but that was not the aim. It's the oil price that have been effective there, and but they have had significant effect on economic growth in Russia. Then to Irina Busygina's and Filipov's paper on Eurasian Economic Union, you can say that the literature falls into two groups. One is the formal and one is the realist. I belong to the realist camp. This is somewhere in between this paper. And I would say that, as you do point out in the paper, it's all about Ukraine. But the first attempt was the single economic space of 2003. That's when Putin first got an idea of CIS. Previously, he hadn't got a clue. And then he tried again. I would put it with the customs union of 2009 as the beginning of a Eurasian Economic Union. And the idea was to engage Ukraine. And all these concessions you're mentioning, yes, they are there on paper. I would argue that they're not real. That in fact, Russia decides. So for example, when Armenia decided to join, it was a meeting between the two presidents, Sargsyan and Putin told Sargsyan, you join. The other countries were not consulted. When Kyrgyzstan joined, it was straightforward trade embargo on Kyrgyzstan, blocking its trade, transit trade with China. So both were forced in by Russia, and it was very much Russia rather than the other countries that did it. And you're completely right that Russia benefits from bilateral relations, but it maintains bilateral relations. As this trade area now looks, it doesn't hang together. So it's more trade diversion than trade generation. The treaty, as you say, it looks very much like the EU treaty. If I remember rightly, 700 pages. It looks very impressive. But I doubt that it has that importance. That's what President Nazarbayev has said repeatedly in public, in very critical tones. And we're now seeing what that was discussed in the first session here today, the Russian-Belarusian Union, which is highly bilateral in its nature. So I doubt that this really matters. Everybody is unhappy about it, and I wouldn't call them a family. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. So I'll take questions from the audience now and then give the panelists an opportunity to respond both to Anders and the people in the audience. Please remember to introduce yourselves.
Thank you so much. Maria Milicio from National Defense University. So my question is for Nigel or David. You can jump in and respond as well because it's about sanctions. I'm going to play a role of a devil's advocate for a moment. So economic sanctions are a tool of economic coercion that are designed to change the target's behavior. Russia has not given Crimea back to Ukraine. Russia is still meddling in East Ukraine. Russia's cyber activity has gone unabated. What do these activities say about the effectiveness of economic sanctions? It also seems like political will in the West to sustain those sanctions has weakened substantially. Just this past Sunday, Oleg Deripaska's companies were desanctioned, right? Thirdly, this argument about the effectiveness of sanctions may be premised on two false assumptions, which are, number one, that oligarchs somehow influence Russia's foreign policy, and number two, that Putin depends on oligarchs. Could it be that the relationship is reversed, that oligarchs depend on their, so oligarch success depends on their proximity to Putin, and secondly, that they really don't have that much of a say in Russia's foreign policy. Thank you.
Hello, Yuval Weber of Daniel Morgan Graduate School. This is a question for Dr. Busygina. When describing sort of the construction of the Eurasian Economic Union, might there not be just a simpler explanation of Russia is attempting to build a hierarchical order or block of its own? So, because in a sense, if I recall correctly, Commonwealth of Independent States, there was lots of bilateral issues. They tried to do something as a multilateral bloc, didn't work. But as Russia tried, before 2011, to go closer and closer to the European Union, and that in and of itself did not work, wasn't, in a sense, the Eurasian Economic Union supposed to be built as a bloc that could compete on the same level as the European Union, to compete at the same level as, let's say, United States and NAFTA and whatever it is that China was doing, so that when it got to the level of sort of this great powerness, in order to engage in this great power competition, it needs these states. And these states, they have to give some amount of honey in order to get these states to sign on to whatever the organization itself. And that would be the, I guess, the pathway towards what I think it was then President Medvedev said, the integration of integrations. Integracja. And so so it seems that perhaps an alternative explanation, why does Russia give something up to make a multilateral organization? It's to essentially in service of this greater strategic goal of competing with, let's say, the European Union, United States, China, and so forth? What's your thoughts?
Hi, I'm Szakonyi from University of Colorado, and I had a question for David's paper, which is, I wanted to ask you about something you didn't talk about, which is if the public do you know, can you comment at all on if the public perceives the economic benefits of sanctions or thinks that they're, like, and I wonder if maybe, like, does the Kremlin really play this up and emphasize it? Do they really try to push a message to the public that, like, look, we're getting new markets, and look, it's okay that the ruble is not worth as much because we can export more or something? Like, how, because this is part of the question, is like public opinion and sanctions. Like, one half of it is if it affects the economy, and the other is how the public reads it. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you. Bill Veal, I'm President Emeritus of the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. I wanted to ask a question about the economy and rents. And the extent, I mean, rents weren't really directly mentioned here that I heard at any rate. And the extent to which the elites are collecting rents, Putin is collecting rents, or resources, whatever you want to call it. What is the capacity of this system as it unwinds here to continue to produce rents? And what's the political consequence of that? Thank you.
We'll take these last two individuals in here.
Kathy Husband, I'll be quick. I just have one question. I've heard a rumor for years that Putin is likely the richest man in the world. If so, why doesn't one hear that more often? If it's true, obviously.
Sarah?
No, I was raising my hand.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I don't have another question.
All right, we'll go in order of the presentation. So David, do you want to respond first both to questions and also to Anders, if you like?
Sure, I think they were really helpful, good comments. The theory on sanctions is that they have a ton of unintended effects. And like I said, if you target certain firms, they're gonna change the way that the economy interrelates and exchanges with the rest of the world, if you like it or not. And yeah, exports weren't targeted, but FDI wasn't targeted either. And capital flows in the Russian stock market weren't necessarily targeted overall. And there was a lot of collateral damage that was inflicted on a ton of other sectors that we never specifically put on a list. So the idea here would be that in other cases of sanctions, there is a cloud of risk that can really make it difficult for this country, whatever targeted country is, to do business with the rest of the world. So my takeaway isn't that the sanctions have or have not really affected exports as a whole per se, and I think 5% actually reducing the trade relationship with the EU is really actually important. It's that Russia's been talking for years about reducing its dependence on oil and gas exports and about creating new markets for its exports of a variety of kinds. And I think this is some of the first evidence we have for in a long time that there are seeds being planted. And if you combine that with the push towards de-dollarization, the reduction of debt from the West, this emphasis of closing off the economy to all of its interrelationships that have made it very vulnerable to policies such as sanctions, there's a conscientious effort on the part of the Kremlin to prevent sanctions from hurting them as much as possible going forward. We're living in a world where the next 10, 20 years, they might be sanctioned from the West, and there's adaptation going on that I think needs to be appreciated because it's going to dilute or blunt the effect of future sanctions on these type of things. We have a lot more left in our arsenal, but we need to, sometimes give credit that the Kremlin's not just blindly accepting the world as it is, and is making, real investments in trying to protect itself and buffer against whatever the West decides to inflict going forward. And I think that's the takeaway from this. And now they seem to have a bit of a budget bump in order to make that happen. And running surpluses makes the next financial crisis hurt less. So it's not just about the volume of sanctions and the relationship and the EU type of thing. It's about how the Kremlin is adapting and whether some of these things protect it going forward. And that's the takeaway that I really want to get. Sarah, they're always talking with both sides of their mouth about sanctions. In some sense, I completely agree with Anders that they hate it more than they could possibly say out loud, and they do rank it exactly like you said. Some things are more painful, some things are less painful. The other side, they're on record at basically every single economic forum highlighting how the sanctions have allowed them to do X, to do Y, and to place a better priority on agriculture and meat production, or to get their arms exports into markets they probably never thought about when they were so reliant on developing goodwill with the West and going in that direction. So I think one of the big critiques of the Kremlin, in terms of, it's almost similar to some American administrations, is they're not really good at public relations for some of the actual, I wouldn't say achievements, but some of the policies that seem to be working better than others. Some of the governance improvements of the last 10 years get swallowed up by repression and by a lot of other negative things that they do in the media and other worlds. But some of the repositioning and restructuring of the economy, it may pay off and may allow the government to stay in power much longer than we anticipate, because there are some pretty capable technocrats making decisions about the allocation of rents in some areas. And if we fail to appreciate that, we're misreading the potential capabilities and capacity of the government to live in a really tense economic environment.
All right. To respond to a couple of questions. The first question, there are many parts, so I may not get to all of them without sanctions. So I'll try to go through your questions in turn and maybe sort of interrogate some of the assumptions behind them. So sanctions are intended to change the target's behavior. Well, partly. That's not their only purpose. That's a very important purpose, and I'll come to that, but it's not the only purpose. One goal of sanctions is usually, and this is true in this case, is to condemn, to express symbolic condemnation of violations of international law and international order. For that reason alone, sanctions can be justified. Again, that's not the only justification and not the most important one in this case. If we're thinking about the intentions, the impact of sanctions, this symbolic, which does not mean merely token, function of sanctions is important. Put it another way. Supposing in response to violations of international law, order, and commitments, no response was forthcoming from the West. That wouldn't be right. That would embolden and encourage not only Russia but others as well. So the symbolic function is very real, but I accept the point that more important than that is the intention to change the target's behavior. Sanctions have not yet achieved the most difficult changes that might be intended for them, but that's no surprise. And we need to look at the much wider history of sanctions and the excellent analyses and studies of comparative sanctions experiences that others have conducted. And what these show is, not surprisingly, that the more fundamental a purpose or goal or objective of a sanctioned state is, the harder it is for sanctions alone to reverse that behavior. I think it's very, especially in the short term, and recall, we're only, in the 5th year of sanctions now, it would be wrong to demand to construct a test for the efficacy of sanctions of a kind we do not fashion or construct for any other instrument of foreign policy. We generally do not argue, well, international aid hasn't eliminated malaria and tuberculosis in 5 years, so let's not bother with international aid anymore. We're in our 17th, this is the 18th year of war in Afghanistan. Yes, some people are saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be there anymore, and that's certainly a separate debate. But people weren't saying that after 5 years. So again, let's not construct false and unhelpful tests about the efficacy of sanctions. Let's compare like with like when we're evaluating the full range of foreign policy instruments. Thirdly, I would argue, this is a matter of interpretation, not a fact, admittedly, that there are signs, there is evidence that at certain important moments in the most fluid fighting in the Donbass in 2014-2015, the threat, not the imposition of sanctions, but the credible threat of much more severe ones did stay Russia's hand at certain important moments. In particular, when it was very likely that Mariupol would simply be taken, and that did not happen. There may be more than one possible interpretation for that, but there were serious discussions at the time that, for example, sanctions on the SWIFT international payment system would be imposed against Russia. So there's a very respectable argument for saying sanctions have made an important difference, not in reversing the most difficult things, again, that's not what sanctions are intended to do, but preventing the escalation of actions already underway on the ground. Now then, one of the new things that happened with the escalation of sanctions last year, it became increasingly clear, and including to many in Russia, that sanctions are no longer a particular instrument that under certain well-defined circumstances might in principle be lifted. They have become part of the larger condition of the Russian-Western relationship that will not be lifted quickly, even supposing, although it will not happen, that we saw a full and complete implementation of the Institute Accords. There are other things going on. The phrase used in the April 6th sanctions designation, a pattern of malign activity around the world, captures a whole ragbag of things, a series of different kinds of behaviors, and not only by the Russian state, but by individuals. So again, I think I take issue with another of the assumptions here that sanctions are being applied to oligarchs only to get at the Russian state. They're being applied to Deripaska because of things that he was himself involved in, not because of his proximity to Putin. So I think if we look in the round, then what we are moving towards is a situation where sanctions will begin to shift the condition of Russia's political economy, and some of the calculations being made by those within it, as we move towards 2024 and the uncertainty whose shadow is lengthening as we approach it. We now have a critical mass of people, increasingly, who may be coming to the view that their core interests are being harmed as a result of Western actions taken in response to the behavior of the Russian state. And we don't know where that series of calculations will lead. We have something quite interesting and significant here. I would take the view also that there is deep and growing disquiet even within the Russian state among important officials who otherwise share little in common on most issues. Patrushev and Kudrin, in different ways, both in the past few months, expressed deep concern about the impact of sanctions. I don't really, they might put a brave face on it. And they might have been sincere a year or two ago, but I really don't. I think that if you could wave a wand now, they'd much rather that the sanctions would get lifted. So they're just a few remarks on those fronts. On rents, I'll leave that to David. It's more of a David question, I think. But I'll just a tiny little thing that I found very fascinating. Igor Avkemiev, the veteran head of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, made some really interesting comments a few months ago about the extent of monopolization of the economy in various regions. And he was very, very critical about the lack of competition and implicitly, at least, the scale of the rent extraction mechanisms there. He used some very, very, very strong language. So I'm sure I spoke for too long, so I'll pass on the baton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to make pay a brief comments to you, Anders, and to the other question of you. Thank you very much. Eurasian Economic Union. I think it's a little bit misleading if we would use the word all. It's all about Ukraine, or it's all about Russia. It is a lot about Ukraine, it's a lot about Russia, but it's not all. I think the Eurasian Economic Union is kind of much more complicated than saying this is all about one part and one actor. And I don't think that we should portray the leaders of the smaller nations, members of the Eurasian Economic Union, as absolutely dependent on Russia. There are numerous manifestations on, for instance, on their deviation of their foreign policy course and foreign policy priorities, from the counter-sanctions to the non-recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So they are looking for other but Russia alternative external partners very, very, very actively, and they're very much not with Russia, so looking from the foreign policy. And you know what? And about the institutions. Yes, we understand that this is formality, but again, we don't know how formal are these formal institutions. So should we say these 700 pages should be throw them into the garbage, or what? You know, at least they are there, and we don't know what role they're going to play in the future. And the question is, okay, it's a lot about Ukraine, but what I tried to say, what I was trying to say, that what could be done, what changes came with Ukraine, what could be done without Ukraine, with the Eurasian Economic Union, how Russia took into account the lessons from the Ukrainian crisis. And I think this is the permanent bargaining process. It's a bargaining process. It's not Russia decides all. This is not the case. This is bargaining. And I would say, if Russia, how others at least implicitly put it, Russia would like to already achieved the absolute domination threshold, when the other nations, these four nations have no other option but to bang wagon with Russia. This is not the case. This is absolutely not the case. And moreover, after the Ukrainian crisis and after the Eurasian Economic Union in its current form, Russia is further. It's from this idea of the absolute domination threshold. It's not the case. It's not the case. And concerning the other question, I don't think this is what you say. This is the alternative explanation. It goes with my explanation, because I didn't want to explain why Russia, but I wanted to explain how Russia acted under existing constraints, and why Russia is doing it. Okay, it is not doing it because of the economic rationale. Absolutely. What do we have in our pocket? We have the geopolitical argument. And here I think you are absolutely right, and I agree with you. That one idea is that the Russia-centered coalition, and this coalition, this is kind of the recognition of the Russian external attractiveness. So the more countries, the better. So Russia is trying to make this coalition and proceeding from the vision of the world as belonging to the great powers and the spheres of influence. Yes, this is here. The other idea would be which is linked to the first idea, and this is our very dear to Mr. Putin. This is the rise of Eurasia. That this century will be the century of Eurasia. And it's not the center of the United States, not the center of the West. This is the center of Eurasia. And so the Eurasian Economic Union together with China. And here we have the idea of combining, of putting them together, this big projects, the Eurasian Economic Union together with the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative. And look, wow, we have the new manifestation, the new macro region. And who have the primary say in these regions? These are two powers. This is China and Russia. And now this talks about the Sino-Russian Union. And so on and so forth. So this is I want to say that I don't disagree with you. So this is what the idea here was not to explain the reason of why Russia is doing this, but how, and trying to say that Russia's position vis-a-vis the smaller countries now are much more difficult than prior to the Ukrainian crisis, and its relative power is reduced. Thank you.
Let me take Bill's question about rents and Kathy's about Putin's wealth. I discuss this extensively in my forthcoming book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, the path from market economy to kleptocracy, which will be out with Yale University Press in May. My assessment of Putin's wealth is $100 to $160 billion. And this is based on the money taken out of the state sector. We know pretty well from 2004, from Boris Nemtsov and Vladimir Milov's book, that Putin, Rothenberg, Kovalchuk, and Timchenko took out $60 billion in 4 years from Gazprom. And they have continued at a similar speed, perhaps slightly less because of lower prices, but say $10 to $15 billion from Gazprom alone, as much from other state institutions, for example in the Sochi Olympics, road construction, and all kinds of the banking and share manipulations. So this altogether puts you around $350 billion in the course of this period. Where does the money go? It goes abroad. And we can see from the Panama Papers and from Russian reports, there are 5 relatives, close relatives of Putin, who have $500 million or more in fortune. There are 4 childhood friends of Putin that have $500 million in fortune or more, and this is what we know. Most of this is hidden in anonymous companies, not least in this country, and normal, really dirty Russian money comes in 20 to 30 shell companies. We know this from Sergei Kolesnikov's testimony about his work together with Nikolai Shamalov. Genial Ban's interview is the best evidence of this in Novia Bremia. So we have a lot of evidence, but we don't have the sums of what is happening outside of Russia. Russia has actually excellent statistics on this, and we can see that it's $35 to $40 billion that goes out of Russia on average in capital flight each year, and this is private money. And the reasonable guess is that half of it belongs to Putin and his cronies since, say, 2006, when they got the machine going, and half of it belongs to other people.
We can take some more questions now. Where are our microphones? Thank you.
Thanks. Sam Sheriff from Rand. I have one comment and a question for Nigel. It's a very interesting discussion on all levels. The comment is that we should be clear that sanctions were in fact sold and advertised as being linked to specific short-term objectives, even if they're now being repackaged as being linked to something else. The very fact that the EU sanctions were, particularly the July 2014 sectoral ones, were put on a 6-month clock tells you that they were not meant for permanence or long-term when they were designed and implemented at first. So even if we're now thinking of them in different terms, the way they were conceived was in fact related to short-term policy objectives. But the question regards what seems to me a little bit of a contradiction in the hypothesis about elites affecting the state policy in the future. On the one hand, we all have noted, and as did you, that there's sort of a dog's breakfast of actions that the U.S. Specifically, but actually the West more generally, is sanctioning. And often we don't even know why we're doing sanctions anymore. We're just another way of saying that is that sanctions relief is no longer really credible. That there are, it's very difficult to make the case that there are specific credible conditions that would produce sanctions relief, and thus the question about effective behavior is sort of, we've moved past that. But in order for you to believe, or in order for elites to believe that taking risky behaviors vis-a-vis their own government would benefit them, they would have to believe that in fact changing the state's behavior would affect Western decisions about sanctions. And so the sanctions relief problem still applies. The lack of credibility regarding sanctions relief is still an issue, even if we're talking about elites calculus as opposed to current decision makers ones. So I'd be interested if you could address that. Thanks.
Thank you. Carly Balzer, Georgetown. I guess on the sanctions, we have to remember when the Obama administration was trying to put this together, their concern was to make sure that we did not affect the living standards of the Russian people in a major way, at least in the short term. It's supposed to be very targeted on the elite and on specific sectors of the economy. The Russians, of course, have consistently said the sanctions are having no impact, but they've also complained about them. Interestingly, the one thing that Russians have said would be sort of the nuclear sanction would be kicking them out of SWIFT, the back clearinghouse. But in 2015, 2016, some of the Russian economists were publishing really interesting data about Russian imports. And the two sectors that they were identifying as places where Russia could not possibly make up in any short term the loss of imports from the West, from America and Europe, were electronics and the oil industry. And stuff I've been reading, that pretty much dropped out of the major economics journals after 2016. Either they decided they'd solved the problem or else they decided it was too sensitive to talk about. Mitrova had a recent paper where she said that the oil industry after 2020 is going to be in very serious difficulty over the sanctions. At least half of the weapon systems that Putin showed off in his Послание back in March have now supposedly been curtailed in some way, and one wonders if that's a guidance system problem, which would track with the electronics difficulties. The next decade is probably the really serious problem for the sanctions, rather than what we've seen up in the last 5 years.
Dan Goldberg, Department of Defense. We talk a lot about how much money is being spirited out of Russia, be it by Putin, be it by the oligarchs or other actors. So my question is it really a problem for us? I grant you we have to look at what it is they're doing once the money gets here. But are we better off having that money stay at home to be taxed by the Russian government and spent on things that are a problem for us? Or should we be quite happy to have them steal the place blind?
Put it all in Trump Tower apartments.
Wait, very, very. Sanctions are far too entertaining a topic that I cannot just get involved in. I mean, first there is the very broad distinction between American and European. I mean, American sanctions are essentially permanent and designed to be punitive. European sanctions are temporary in theory and designed to be transactional, though they haven't actually had any transactional impact. But as has been noticed, there are a lot more means by which Russian wealth holders have influence in Europe than is true in the United States. And therefore, people in Brussels have to be more cautious about how they impose sanctions than do people in OPAC. I mean, people in OPAC got a oligarchs list out of Forbes magazine, rather than calling over to the State Department or the intelligence agencies to find out who the Russian oligarchs were. Second, a lot of Europeans increasingly see American sanctions policy, particularly with the new American Congress, as being as much, if not more, a matter of American domestic politics than of international relations. That when the Democrats in the House of Representatives seek to sanction the president by indirectly through sanctioning Russia, they ask the question to what extent this does or does not reflect the interest of the European Union, European governments, European corporations. And third, a question that I have been asked by Germans. Okay, you Americans tell us German companies that we cannot spend our private money on a commercial project with Russia, but you do not tell Boeing Aircraft to discontinue its design and engineering center right smack in the middle of Moscow, which is one of the two biggest engineering centers Boeing Aircraft operates anywhere in the world. Could you Americans show us a little more consistency? I gave them an answer to that, which is, well, of course not.
Any other questions from the audience? And one in the back, Jesse.
Jesse Driscoll, UCSD. This is a question for Nigel. If you don't mind, could you just walk us through a scenario under which the European sanctions would be lifted, from your perspective, the chairman? I think that the distinction that was made in the previous question embedded in it between American and European sanctions is worth expanding on a little bit further, and you're perfectly positioned to do so.
Any other questions? Okay, so
Hey, Brian.
Oh,
It's okay. I did have one, but.
go ahead, go ahead, we have time.
All right, this is for David, and it's a bit off the direct theme of the panel, but it's something that you mentioned briefly in the written version of the memo, and it's also something you mentioned in one of your answers. It's about the budget bump that comes with the influx of rubles, given the decoupling of the exchange rate. And you talked about how it provides some resilience to sanctions as well as some preparation for future crises. This goes back to the theme from the first panel and also the second panel. There's a bit of tension, I think, perhaps even among the systemic liberals about how much of this money needs to be kept for resilience and for future crises versus how much of it needs to be used for state-driven investment in human and physical capital. I'm wondering if you've got a sense of how that might play out over the next couple of years.
Okay, we'll go in the reverse order this time, so beginning with Irina, responses to the audience and any final words.
Thank you very much, you know,
Okay, so that's quick, okay. I'm sure I won't be quite as quick. All right, that's a lot. Apologies if I don't quite get to everything, but please find me in the break. I'd be more than happy to share views over something caffeinated. Okay, yes, the conditionality of sanctions. So, indeed, the first sanctions were specifically targeted in response to specific actions and changes with at least potentially the hope that those might be reversed. Again, it's not the case that the only purpose of sanctions is to try to bring about change. Punishment is important as well, and symbolic reaffirmation of principles of international order matter too. But in respect of intention to bring about changes in behavior, yes, in the first year or two, the sanctions were linked to particular potential actions. But what's happened in the past year or so is that sanctions have increasingly become an instrument of choice in response to a widening range of behaviors. Again, a pattern of malign activity around the world. That includes the Salisbury nerve agent attack, the actions in Syria, and various other things. Possibly, I don't know, the timing and the sort of the dots that one can join are intriguing, possibly things involved in related to the Mueller investigation. I don't know for sure. Does that increasing use of sanctions to cover a wider range of actions, and does the increasingly long-term, as it were, existential role of sanctions in the Russian-Western relationship mean that sanctions are forever? No, of course not. No one thinks that from now into the indefinite future, sanctions will never be lifted. It's difficult to imagine Russia under present management bringing about the changes in its behaviors, its policies, its underlying orientations that might warrant, justify an easing of sanctions. But that's not the same as saying that sanctions will be there forever. That's quite a different matter. But I think implicitly, we are moving, and again, no one is explicit about this, it's just the drift and direction of policy and thinking and the psychologies that underlie policy thinking. We're moving to a situation where it's unlikely that we'll see, particularly on the American side, any significant change in the approach to sanctions unless something pretty significant happens within Russia. That does not mean that the purpose of these sanctions is to bring about change in Russia. I do not happen to think that sanctions have been, even the recent or last year's ones, have been designed in order, in some explicit Machiavellian manipulative way to turn elites against Putin. I do not think that's the intent behind them. Interestingly, there's been quite a bit of discussion going back to last week in the Russian media about this. And almost a preemptively loyal article saying you will never split the oligarchs from the Russian state. No one has in the West has suggested that's the purpose of sanctions, but there's a kind of preemptive defensiveness within Russia itself, which I do find quite intriguing. So, what else? Just on energy side, I entirely agree with you, Ali, that it's really over the next few years, and there's a growing recognition of this. Look at things that Putin is saying. Look at these remarks that Patrushev made to governors in central Russia. He made precisely this point, that sanctions are exposing the vulnerability of Russia's energy sector to restrictions on the supply of technology, finance for technology in particular, and this is causing severe and growing difficulties. Absolutely. And that's what the sanctions, the sectoral sanctions, were designed to do, to create cumulative impacts over time. So in that respect, those sanctions at least are working in the way that they were intended to. On the question of where it's best for Russian money to be as far as the West is concerned, well, I mean, the first point to make there is that when it flows out of Russia, it doesn't necessarily flow into Western economies, it flows offshore. And so the Global Witness estimate is around $100 billion of Russian money, never mind anyone else's money, in the past decade or so. One might add that when it does flow into at least some Western societies, it doesn't just sit there, it does the work of influencing and attempting to co-opt elements of Western elites, actually, and that's concerning lords on boards and all the rest of it. It creates interests that seek to, as well as the oligarch valley services that have been quietly resisting the imposition of sanctions. That's a serious point. These are well-connected sectors: finance, property, public relations, and so on. So this is not neutral or benign, I would say. It's more complicated than that. On the matter of the EU, I think there's interesting response of the EU, especially since last year, since the Salisbury attack, is the new determination to scrutinize incoming wealth and its provenance. It's not a matter of sanctions, it's a matter of standards. And in principle, that it applies to all money flowing into Great Britain in the first instance, but other EU countries as well. But of course, especially it's relevant to Russia. What did I write there? Anyway, so I think that we are going to see steady increases in that, rather than any appetite for lifting sanctions. But the distinctions that a number of people have made in their questions between EU sanctions and American ones is a useful distinction to make, because it does remind us that one of the new things that happened in the world of Russian sanctions last year was the exposure of the challenges of, as it were, alliance management and sanctions. The whole Rationale EN Plus episode and its possible resolution in the last few days is one case in point. Nord Stream 2 is another case in point. Jesse, flattery will get you everywhere, but I'm certainly not perfectly placed to address your challenging difficult questions. To be honest, I want to think about it a bit more, rather than give you a kind of soundbite response to the circumstances on EU sanctions would be lifted, rather than the EU sanctions regime eroding through defection of individual states. But let's talk about that over coffee.
Great, I'm going to go in reverse order. So, Brian, I think that's the classic dilemma over the last 20 years: is the liberals want to save and the conservatives, or this is the key, want to spend. And you can hear me?
Can't hear you.
Oh, is it not on? Yeah. Sorry. The liberals want to save, and the conservatives, this is the key, want to spend because they're going to get all the rents from that and enjoy loyalty and all the perks that come from that. What I see, and I could be incorrect, I'm curious, people have different impressions, is that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when the Olympics were won and the World Cup was won, the spenders won, but they squandered their opportunity to spend, and they did it so corruptly that they lost their second chance to go down that road again. So I don't think the liberals have won. The liberals, I think, have, if we're gonna spend, we need to do it more intelligently. We're gonna do it on things that are at least gonna have some sort of tangible, positive economic impact. And if you look at the type of massive infrastructure projects that are under consideration in the last 6 months, these competitions that they now have, where you're submitting bids and proposals, I wanna link these two cities with a high-speed train line, or I wanna build out this railroad. The way that they're evaluating the projects, I think, is fundamentally different from what it did when, say, they were building Rosa Couture. And if anybody's been to Rosa Couture in the last 3 years, it's the most depressing place, basically in Russia, because you have billions and billions of dollars in a train that has 3 people on it. And I don't think they're blind to the fact that this infrastructure is basically useless. So that's how I see this dilemma shaking out in the future. They're gonna spend, but I think the liberals are gonna be able to constrain it a little bit. And the real question going forward is, to what extent are these investments going to pay off? To what extent is that influence going to not repeat the scenario where so much was squandered over all of those years? This question about money, yeah, it's tempting to say that money would be useful here, but my biggest bonus is, my other hat is really in the anti-corruption sphere, is I don't think the Western citizenry fundamentally understands how much corrupt money affects your day-to-day life. And I say this as somebody who spent their last cities in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., and how difficult it is to buy a house. If we could somehow communicate to American citizens that you may be paying 10 to 15% more in urban areas because of our lax regulations on foreign money, that would resonate. Or the fact that Tribeca is a ghost town is not that's not a coincidence. It's because most of that money is abroad, and we've lost a major part of our best American city to foreign cash. So there are these substantial costs, but they're so dispersed and they're hard to nail down that we all feel, but it's not, we don't have a politician right now in this country that's able to articulate how each and every one of us is affected by foreign money in this country in myriad ways. I think that would be a great platform for a candidate going forward, is to say exactly that much. And the second part of it is that, you know, from a study of autocracy, when the money stays in Russia, money is voice, money is power. And that when oligarchs have to keep their money there, they're gonna start placing different demands on the government. So you wanna get it back there as soon as possible, because they're so afraid of it getting expropriated down the road. So by blocking it off from the West, that's the best way to make a government that's more accountable. I don't know if it's gonna be democratic, I don't know if it's a different government, but there's gonna be placing demands from money that can't exit. So I think those are the two sides of that coin that we really need to take into consideration when we decide whether or not we want this money. And then Harley, I think you tapped on like a really interesting thing, and the closest analogy would be climate change, right? We all know that there's this cliff that we're speeding towards in 20 years, 40 years, and we're basically unprepared for what happens when the real effects really start to be felt. And the same is with the Russian economy with the sanctions. They've had a 10-year warning. 15 years, just like we have 30 or 50 years about climate change. But I would have thought an autocratic government might have been a little bit more effective and effectful in terms of being prepared, but it doesn't look like it. And I think that's really interesting, and that unless they start investing in technology, investing in expertise, preventing brain drain, finding alternate sources for the technology if they exist, or making concessions to the West to mitigate the damage and get some of this lifted, they're going to be in a situation not unlike the world in 50 years, where there's just no way out of this dilemma that I think the West has put on. But again, that's another public relations problem that hasn't been communicated, that the sanctions are cumulative, they take a long time, and the cliff is farther down the road, and it's out, the ball's in the Russian government's court, and it's going to try to capture this.
My cliff analogy would be Brexit, and that's not soon enough.
Yeah, that's self-inflicted.
So the last minute we'll give to Anders.
Yeah, thank you. Wanted to follow up what David said here on dark money. Just think of dimensions. There's at least $800 billion of Russian money abroad, private money. Some put it at $1.3 trillion. US elections cost $5 billion. The total presidential and all congressional elections. So this is dirt cheap in comparison. In the last midterm elections, there were a couple of hundreds of millions of dark money that nobody knows where it comes from. It can be Russian money. So it's perfectly possible to buy US elections. Swedish elections cost $12 million. German elections, $100 million. Ukrainian elections, $1 billion. So, and in the Ukrainian election, probably there will be $500 million of dark Russian money supporting all candidates so that they can be properly discredited as corrupt and paid for by foreigners. This is extremely dangerous. I checked the Gerhard Schröder's fee for being chairman of Rosneft, only $600,000. He's also on chairman of the board of Nord Stream, which might be more, and he's a very loyal supporter of Putin. Western politicians are very rich, and Russian money is very big. I should just add on Sam's point that it's, as you know here, it's often said in town that sanctions are a tool and not a policy. But since there is no other tool that is being used, it is the only policy in town. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you to all the panelists. And I wanted to remind everyone, we'll have a coffee break now. The coffee is in the hallway. And please stay and join us for the final panel beginning at 4 p.m., which is on Russia's foreign policy. Thank you.
This is a real question. We now have lots of evidence of
found by election, you don't know what you get when you open the package.
Well, and the other thing is, what is on Facebook or whatever. Had an
because they buy not just Russians buy.
Sure.
And she was showing how they target what the West is doing. Well, that's my question. Sort of like push
right.
That's one thing. You know, for sure. Everybody
So